I lost over 60 pounds of tomatoes in a single summer, and it was entirely my own fault. Not bad luck, not pests, not some freak weather event. Just plain old gardening mistakes I kept making year after year because nobody sat me down and told me the truth. My dad, rest his soul, he tried. He told me half of this stuff when I was young, and I thought I knew better. Took me losing more harvests than I care to admit before I finally started listening. Today I'm walking you through 15 common garden mistakes that are costing you your harvest every single year. These are not obscure problems. These are the ones I see in nearly every garden I visit, and most of them I have made myself. Now, the last mistake on this list is the one that genuinely changed how I think about my entire growing season, and I spent the better part of a decade getting it wrong before the light finally came on. I'm also going to share a bonus technique after the main list that has nothing to do with any of these 15. But it is something I stumbled onto about 4 years ago that gave me an extra 3 to 4 weeks of harvest in the fall, and I think you're going to want to hear it. Here's the thing that ties all of this together. A garden is a system, not a collection of individual plants. Every decision you make, from where you put your beds, to how you water, to when you fertilize, those decisions do not exist in isolation. They compound. A small mistake in soil prep leads to weak roots, which leads to poor nutrient uptake, which leads to disease susceptibility, which leads to a lost harvest. My dad used to say a garden remembers everything you did to it and everything you did not do. I did not understand that for years, but he was right. So let me walk you through what I have learned the hard way, starting with the one that costs more people more food than just about anything else. You know what kills me? I watch people spend hundreds of dollars on raised beds, fancy seeds, beautiful trellises, and then they stick the whole setup on the north side of their house behind a 2-story wall. I did this with my very first garden. I was 23, renting a little place, and I put my tomato containers right next to the back door because it was convenient. That spot got maybe 3 hours of direct sun. 3 hours. I could not figure out why my tomatoes were lanky, pale, and barely producing. And my dad came over, looked at it, and just said, "Son, the plants need to see the sky." He was being polite. What he meant was I had stuck sun-loving vegetables in a shade hole. If you're in the northern hemisphere, your garden needs a south-facing exposure, period. Most of your fruiting vegetables, your tomatoes, peppers, squash, beans, they want a minimum of 6 to 8 hours of direct sunlight. Before you build a single bed or plant a single seed, go outside and actually watch where the sun travels across your property. Do it in the morning, at noon, and in the late afternoon. There's a free tool online called SunCalc, where you can enter your address and see exactly how the sun moves across your property throughout the entire year. 10 minutes with that tool can save you an entire season of disappointment. This is the foundation. Every other tip I'm about to give you falls apart if your garden is sitting in the shade. Now that pairs directly with the next mistake, because even if you get the sun right, most people completely botch their soil and do not even know it. I'm not talking about buying the wrong brand. I am talking about filling your beds or planting directly into ground that has no life in it and expecting miracles. When I finally moved my garden into full sun, I filled my raised beds with the cheapest bulk soil I could find. It looked fine, dark, and crumbly, but within 6 weeks it had compacted into something that felt like modeling clay. My pepper roots could not push through it. My lettuce bolted early because the roots were stressed. That soil had almost no organic matter, no microbial activity, nothing. Here's what I wish someone had told me. Your soil should be roughly 1/3 quality compost from multiple sources, 1/3 good topsoil or native soil if yours is decent, and 1/3 aeration material like perlite or coarse vermiculite. If you grab a handful and squeeze it, it should hold together loosely and then crumble apart when you poke it. If it holds together like a baseball, you have a drainage problem. If it falls apart like sand, you have a retention problem. Get this right, and half of your other gardening problems simply go away. But here's where it gets interesting, because good soil is only half the equation if you are starving it after the first season. The third big mistake I see is treating your garden soil like it is a one-time purchase instead of a living thing that needs to be fed. After my first decent season, I just planted again the following spring without adding a single thing. Same beds, same soil, nothing new. And the results were noticeably worse. Smaller tomatoes, fewer peppers, pale leaves everywhere. And my dad looked at my beds and said, "You took everything out and put nothing back." He was right again. Every harvest removes nutrients from your soil. If you are not adding 2 to 3 inches of quality compost to your beds every single fall or early spring, you are running a deficit. Think of it like a bank account. You cannot keep withdrawing and never making deposits. Top dress with compost, work in some aged manure, throw in a layer of leaf mold, whatever you have access to. But feed that soil every year without exception. If you are finding this useful, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. I put out straightforward gardening advice like this every week. No gimmicks, no nonsense, just what actually works. All right, let me keep going because we are just getting started. Now, this next one is going to sound almost too simple, but I want you to hear me out because I ignored this advice for years and it cost me plenty. Watering at the wrong time of day. I used to water in the evening because that is when I had time. Seemed logical, right? Come home from work, grab the hose, water the garden. What I did not realize is that wet foliage sitting overnight in cool temperatures is an open invitation for fungal diseases. Powdery mildew, blight, leaf spot, all of them love damp leaves in the dark. Once I switched to watering first thing in the morning, before 8 in the morning ideally, my fungal problems drop by easily 70%. Morning watering gives the leaves time to dry in the sun and lets the roots absorb moisture during the peak growing hours. If morning watering is truly impossible for you, then water at the base of the plants and keep the foliage dry. Drip irrigation or soaker hoses are perfect for this. Speaking of watering, the closely related mistake is watering too often and too shallow. This is the one that probably took me the longest to break because it feels so good to water your garden. It feels like you are doing something helpful. But when you give your plants a light sprinkle every single day, you are training those roots to stay near the surface where the moisture is. Shallow roots mean weak plants. What you want is deep, infrequent watering. For most vegetable gardens, that means a good, thorough soaking 2 to 3 times per week, rather than a little bit every day. You want that water to penetrate at least 6 to 8 inches down. Stick your finger into the soil up to your second knuckle. If it is dry down there, water deeply. If it is still moist, leave it alone. I started doing this, and within a single season, my tomato plants were noticeably sturdier and more drought resistant. They had been forced to send roots deep looking for water, and that made them tougher plants overall. Here's one that seems almost too obvious to mention, but I see it constantly, and I did it myself for longer than I want to admit. Planting too close together. I used to look at those little transplants sitting in their 4-inch pots and think there is no way these need 18 inches of space. They're tiny. So I would cram them in shoulder to shoulder. 6 weeks later, I had a jungle with no airflow, disease spreading like wildfire, and fruit rotting on the vine because nothing could dry out. Your seed packet or plant tag gives you a spacing recommendation for a very good reason. Tomatoes need a minimum of 18 to 24 inches between plants. Peppers need 12 to 18 inches. Even lettuce needs 6 to 8 inches. Give your plants room to breathe. Good air circulation is one of the most underrated disease prevention tools you have, and it costs you absolutely nothing. Now, I want to shift gears a little because the next mistake is one that is less about technique and more about timing and timing in the garden is everything. Planting too early in the spring. I get it. After a long winter, you are itching to get out there. You see one warm weekend in March, and you think, this is it, time to plant. Then 2 weeks later, you get a late frost, and everything you planted is dead. I've lost entire flats of tomato transplants to late frost because I was impatient. Here's my rule now. I do not plant warm season crops, your tomatoes, peppers, squash, beans, until the soil temperature is consistently above 60 degrees Fahrenheit, and I'm at least 2 weeks past my area's average last frost date. Not the earliest possible last frost date, the average one. You can get a cheap soil thermometer for about $8 at any garden center. Stick it 4 inches into the ground first thing in the morning. If it reads below 60, wait. Your patience will be rewarded with plants that actually take off instead of sitting there stunned and stressed. Related to that, and this is a mistake that cost me an entire crop of sweet corn one year, is ignoring your specific microclimate. Just because the calendar says it is time to plant does not mean your particular spot is ready. I have a low area in my yard that stays cooler and wetter than the rest of the property. I planted corn there because that is where I had space. And it sat in cold, wet soil, and half the seeds rotted before they ever germinated. Meanwhile, my neighbor on higher ground had corn up 6 inches already. Pay attention to the low spots, the areas near walls that hold heat, the places that stay wet after rain. Your garden has its own little climate zones, and learning them takes a season or two of observation, but that knowledge is worth more than any tool you can buy. All right, this next one is something my dad drilled into me, and I ignored because I thought it was old-fashioned advice: not rotating your crops. If you plant tomatoes in the same spot year after year, you are building up a population of soil-borne diseases and pests that specifically target that tomatoes. Same goes for any plant family. The nightshade family, that is your tomatoes, peppers, eggplant, and potatoes, should not go in the same bed more than 1 year out of every 3 at minimum, ideally 4 years. I planted tomatoes in the same 2 raised beds for 3 straight seasons, and by year 3, I had such a bad case of early blight that I lost nearly 40% of my crop before August. Moved them to fresh beds the next year, same varieties, same care, and the difference was night and day. Healthy plants, heavy fruit set, minimal disease. If you have limited space, at the very least, rotate between your plant families. Follow nightshades with legumes, follow legumes with brassicas, follow brassicas with root crops. It does not have to be complicated. It just has to happen. Here's one I wish I could go back and tell my younger self about, because it would have saved me a lot of money and frustration. Over-fertilizing. More is not better when it comes to feeding your plants. I used to dump synthetic fertilizer on everything on a weekly basis because I figured if a little is good, a lot must be great. Wrong. All that excess nitrogen gave me enormous, beautiful tomato plants with almost no fruit. The plants were so busy growing leaves they never bothered to set tomatoes. On top of that, the excess fertilizer salts were burning the root tips and actually reducing the plant's ability to take up water. These days I use a balanced organic fertilizer, something like a 4-4-4 or a 5-5-5, applied once at planting and maybe once more at mid-season. That is it. If your soil has good compost in it, your plants are already getting most of what they need. A University of California study showed that home gardens with moderate, consistent fertility outproduced heavily fertilized gardens by about 15%, mostly because the over-fertilized gardens had more pest and disease pressure from all of that excess nitrogen. Now this ties right into something I rarely see people talk about, and it is one of the biggest silent harvest killers out there. Not mulching your beds. I went years without mulching because I thought it was just for aesthetics, something people did to make their gardens look tidy for the neighbors. I could not have been more wrong. A 2 to 3 inch layer of organic mulch, straw, shredded leaves, even grass clippings, as long as they are herbicide-free, does 3 critical things. It holds moisture in the soil so you water less. It suppresses weeds so you spend less time on your knees pulling them, and it moderates soil temperature, keeping roots cooler in summer and warmer during cool snaps. The year I finally started mulching consistently, my water usage dropped by roughly a third, and my weed problems dropped by at least half. Use straw or shredded leaves in vegetable beds. Save the wood chips for your pathways and perennial plantings, because fresh wood chips can temporarily tie up nitrogen as they decompose, and your vegetables do not need that competition. All right, this one is short, but it matters more than most people think. Not pruning your tomatoes. I am talking specifically about indeterminate varieties, the ones that keep growing all season. If you let them go completely wild, you get a tangled mess with poor airflow, lots of disease, and a bunch of small, mediocre fruit. Pinch out the suckers, those little shoots that emerge in the crotch between the main stem and a branch, at least on the bottom 18 inches of the plant. This directs the plant's energy into fewer but larger, better quality fruit, and dramatically improves air circulation. Takes about 30 seconds per plant once a week. I started doing this consistently, and my average tomato size went up noticeably while disease problems went down. Here's one that might ruffle some feathers, but I'm going to say it because it is true. Most people harvest too late. They wait for that perfect moment when the tomato is deep red all the way around, or the zucchini is the size of a baseball bat. By then you have already passed peak flavor, and the plant is putting energy into oversized fruit instead of setting new ones. Pick your tomatoes when they are just starting to show full color, what the commercial growers call the breaker stage, and let them finish ripening on your kitchen counter. They will taste just as good, and your plant will immediately start putting energy into the next round of fruit. Zucchini should be harvested at 6 to 8 inches, not 12. Beans should be picked before the seeds bulge visibly inside the pod. Green peppers should be firm and full size, but not necessarily change to the mature color unless that is what you want. Frequent harvesting signals to the plant that it needs to keep producing, and that is how you get a bigger overall harvest from fewer plants. And this brings me to the one I told you about at the beginning, the mistake that fundamentally changed how I approached my garden, and honestly, it took me almost 10 years to figure out. It is not keeping a garden journal. I know that sounds underwhelming compared to some dramatic revelation, but hear me out, because this one is the linchpin that makes everything else work. For years, I relied on my memory. I figured I would remember when I planted things, what varieties worked, what spacing I used, when the first frost came, when the pests showed up. I remembered none of it accurately. I kept making the same mistakes because I literally could not remember the specific lessons from the previous season. 4 years ago, I started keeping a simple notebook by my back door. Nothing fancy. Every time I plant something, I write the date, the variety, and the location. Every time I notice a problem, I write it down. When I harvest, I jot down approximately how much I got. When the first and last frost actually happen, I record those. The first year I did this, I went back and read my spring entries in the fall and was genuinely shocked at how much I had already forgotten. The second year, I could look back and see exactly when my squash vine borers showed up the previous season. It was July 8th, and I had row covers in place by July 1st. I saved my entire squash crop that year. By year 3, I had enough data to know which tomato varieties actually performed best in my specific garden, not what the catalog said, but what actually produced for me in my soil, my microclimate, my conditions. It turned out San Marzano consistently outperformed every other paste tomato I tried, and Celebrity was my most reliable slicer. I would never have known that without written records. A garden journal turns random annual gardening into a compounding body of knowledge. Every season makes you smarter, but only if you write it down. You do not need an app. You do not need a spreadsheet. A $3 notebook and a pencil by your back door will change your gardening life. I genuinely believe that. Now let me talk about a few patterns. I see people fall into that tie several of these mistakes together. The first one is what I call the set it and forget it approach. Someone builds a garden, fills it with soil, plants everything, and then basically just hopes for the best. No regular watering schedule, no feeding, no observation. A garden is a relationship. It needs consistent attention, not necessarily hours a day, but 15 to 20 minutes of walking through, looking at your plants, checking soil moisture, spotting problems early. That little bit of daily attention prevents most of the disasters I've talked about today. The second pattern is chasing trends instead of mastering basics. Every year there's some new miracle product or technique making the rounds on social media. Meanwhile, the fundamentals, good soil, proper watering, appropriate spacing, crop rotation, these are the things that actually produce food year after year. I fell for the trendy stuff plenty of times in my early years, and it was always the boring basics that pulled my garden through. The third pattern is treating every plant the same. Your tomatoes and your lettuce have completely different needs for water, sun, fertility, and timing. When you water everything on the same schedule and fertilize everything with the same product at the same rate, something is always getting too much or too little. Take the time to learn what each plant family actually needs and adjust accordingly. It does not take much extra effort once you understand the basics. Now, here's that bonus I promised you at the beginning. This one is not on the main list, but it has been one of the most valuable things I've added to my routine. It is fall succession planting for a late harvest extension. Most people think of succession planting as a spring and summer thing, staggering your lettuce plantings every 2 weeks, so you do not get it all at once. But what I started doing 4 years ago is counting backwards from my average first frost date and planting a second round of cool season crops in mid to late summer. I am in zone 6, so my first frost is typically around mid-October. That means I can plant a round of spinach, radishes, kale, and lettuce around August 1st, which gives them a solid 70 to 75 days before hard frost. The trick is that these crops actually taste better in cool weather because the plants convert starches to sugars as temperatures drop. My fall planted spinach is sweeter and more tender than anything I grow in spring. I get 3 to 4 extra weeks of fresh harvesting that I used to just leave on the table. If you are in a warmer zone, you can push this even later. If you are in a colder zone, use row cover fabric to buy yourself another 2 to 3 weeks. This single technique added roughly 20% more total harvest to my season, and it uses beds that would otherwise just be sitting empty. If any of this was helpful to you today, I would appreciate it if you would subscribe and share this with someone who could use it. And I want to hear from you. Which of those mistakes have you been making? Or did I miss one that cost you a harvest? Drop it in the comments because I read every single one, and honestly, some of the best advice I have ever gotten came from people just like you sharing what worked in their garden. That is 15 mistakes that do not need to keep costing you food every season. A garden is not complicated when you get the fundamentals right, and now you've got a solid list to work from. Happy gardening, and I will see you in the next one.